Dear friends, I'd like to say some words about this week's Parsha, the double Parsha of Tazria-Metzora, which we read this past Shabbat. And first thing I want to say is that we have a certain amount of double Parshiot during the year. This is, of course, to accommodate the calendar because there are 53 Parshiot in the Torah. There are actually, let's say, well, in the lunar year, it depends, but since our years are sort of lunar and solar together, there are 54 weeks in a solar year, let's say. But even so, even when we have a leap year and it's about the same, we have chagim, we have holidays that override the weekly parasha. So often we have more parshiot to finish than we have Shabbatot, which are free in the year, and therefore we have to double up the parshiot. Now, some of the parshiot are doubled up for this convenience. But on the other hand, you have Parshiot like Tazria-Metzora, where it's quite obvious that they are a continuation of each other, that theoretically you would think they should have been one Parsha. And possibly because it was so long as one Parsha was split up into two. What do I mean by that? You see, Parshat Tazria-Metzora is like a sandwich. You have a topic which begins at the beginning and it also is at the end. And in the middle, you have a second topic. So there are sort of like two topics in this parsha, and one of them starts at the beginning and finishes at the end of the second parsha. At the end of Metzora starts at the beginning of Tazria, finishes at the end of Metzora, and the other and let's say the main topic, which is Sarat, biblical leprosy, takes up most of these two parshiot. So let me give you an example. The beginning, or explain how this happens. So the beginning of Tazria talks about a woman giving birth, and after she gives birth, whether it's to a male or a female, she has a certain amount of days where she is impure, like what's called the nida. She's impure either for a week or 2 weeks, and this is at the beginning of this week's parasha. And at the end of Metzora, you have what seems to be like a continuation, because there you actually have the laws of nida and what's called zav for a man and zava for a woman, and nocturnal emission for a man, and he has to go to the mikveh, etc. So these personal issues of purity and impurity start at the beginning of Tazria, stop very quickly, and continue at the end of Metzora, also for a very short period of time. In the middle, you have all the laws of the biblical leprosy. Now, in Tazria, you have all the laws talking about the different types of biblical leprosy, and in Metzora, you have the korbanot, the offerings that the leper has to bring after they are over their biblical leprosy. Now, I call this biblical leprosy because it is very different from the leprosy that we know of today. Today, what was once called leprosy is referred to as Hansen's disease. It is a dermatological disease. And today there are trufot, there are medications that can be taken in order to control this disease. This disease was known in antiquity too. However, the biblical description of sarat, of leprosy, seems to be quite different than any description that we have of ancient leprosy, even the biblical descriptions of ancient leprosy. And I don't have to look far to find this, because the two haftarot, that of course is Pas Shabbat, we didn't read because it was Rosh Chodesh, we read the Rosh Chodesh haftarah, but what we read from the prophets and the haftarah, from Parshat Tazria and Parshat Metzora, in both cases, which is talking about leprosy in antiquity, in the time of the first temple, are very different than the description of biblical leprosy. Let me explain. You see, biblical leprosy is something which happens on a human being, first and foremost. And there are different spots and they have different colors on the human being, mostly white. But in addition to be found on your body, surprisingly, it could be found on your clothing. And in addition to be found in your clothing, it can be found on your house, on the wall of your house, and then you have to remove it from the wall and sometimes knock down the house, depending on how much leprosy there is on the house. So this seems to be a very unusual type of sickness, which has only seems to be partially affecting the human body, but also affects clothing and houses, which is very unusual. To make it even more unusual, the Talmud says it's called Metzora, the Hebrew word for leprosy, because it's motzi shem ra. When you gossip, when you slander people verbally, that's how you get leprosy. Hmm. I've never heard of a disease that, by the way you talk, the disease, you catch the disease. But that is the way the Talmud describes biblical leprosy. And it can be proven, actually, because you have two stories of biblical leprosy already told in the book of Exodus. One of them, of course, is Moshe. Now, with Moshe, if you remember, God sends him to Egypt and gives him three signs to show the elders of Israel. And what are the three signs? The first one is that he takes his staff, throws it down, it turns into a serpent, and then he picks it up and it becomes again a staff. That's number one. And then God says, and if they don't believe you for this, here's number two. And number two is he takes his hand, puts it in his bosom, in his underneath his other arm, pulls it out, and he becomes leprous, puts it back in again, and the leprosy disappears. Number three, he takes water from the Nile, pours it on the land, and it turns into blood. Now, the Midrash says a very unusual thing about sign number two. The Midrash says sign number two is not supposed to be sign number two. There are only supposed to be two signs. However, when Moses said about the people of Israel, Vehem lo yaminu li, they will not believe me, God said, who? You're saying bad people, bad things about them. You're saying the evil tongue. You're slandering the Jewish people. Who says that they're not? Who says that they won't believe you? You shouldn't say things like that. And therefore, according to the Midrash, God punished Moshe by giving him leprosy. It's true; it appears like a sign because then he pulls it out again, it's gone. But it was a remez, it was a hint to Moshe that if you keep slandering the Jewish people, you'll get leprosy because you're saying bad things about them. Another, of course, story we have just like that is the story of Miriam in Bamidbar, where Miriam and Aaron, but it seems to be particularly Miriam, was very angry about the Ethiopian wife that Moses, according to Rashi, divorced, meaning Zipporah. I'm interpreting it according to Rashi. Rashi says that, of course, Moses had married Zipporah, a Midianite woman, and then at a certain point after Mount Sinai, after the Decalogue at Mount Sinai, he was told to leave his wife and Jethro and to stay with her father-in-law. And Miriam is talking to Aaron about this, saying, "What's going on? We're also prophets. We didn't have to leave our spouses. Why does Moshe have to leave his spouse? What's going on?" And because they were gossiping about Moshe, so Miriam was smitten with leprosy and had to stay 7 days outside the camp until the leprosy disappeared and then came back. Now, so those are cases of leprosy that seem to have happened because of, and I have to call it biblical leprosy, because of saying bad things about somebody in both cases. So that could possibly where the Talmud takes the idea from. But if we compare it to the Haftarah of both Tazria and Metzora, we can see that already that type of biblical leprosy was long gone. Let me give you an example. In Tazria, the Haftorah is about Naaman. Naaman was the name of the chief of staff of the army of Aram. Aram, which was a nation just to the east of the Jordan River and just north of Ammon and Moab. And it says that he was a leper. He was the chief of staff of the army, and he was a leper. And a young girl who, I guess, in one of the wars against Israel, he took as a captive to work in his house. So this young girl says to him, and I guess she must have liked him. She said to him, "Look, you're a leper, and there is a prophet in the kingdom of Israel who you fought, who can actually help you get out of your leprosy." And so Naaman is very impressed by this. He says, "Okay," and he turns to the king of Aram, says, "Can you please send a letter to the king of Israel and request that I have a meeting with the prophet in Israel?" So, of course, the king of Israel at that time didn't get along very well with Elisha. So he said, "Oh, he's looking for an excuse for war. How am I going to get rid of his leprosy?" And Elisha says to the king, "What are you talking about? I want them to know that there's a true prophet in Israel. Tell them I'll meet with them." So Naaman comes with his entourage, and he comes to meet Elisha, but Elisha doesn't want to really actually see him because he was an enemy of Israel. So he sends down Gehazi, his right-hand man, and Gehazi tells him, "Immerse yourself in the Jordan 7 times." Now, Naaman doesn't want to do that. He says, "What's this? He didn't even talk to me." But one of his men says, "Look, we came this far. Let's just do it, right? Maybe it's something. Maybe there is something to it. Davar gadol diber lecha. Maybe there's something great about it." And then he goes to the Jordan. He immerses 7 times, and his leprosy completely disappears, and he has the skin of a young child. So he goes back, of course, to thank Elisha, which is a very interesting story by itself. I don't want to dwell on it at the moment, but the point is that whatever he's told to do about his leprosy has nothing to do with the leprosy that's talked about in Tazria-Metzora. Number one, when you have leprosy, you're supposed to be seen by a priest, not by a Kohen, and Elisha was not a Kohen. Secondly, you're supposed to be quarantined off for 7 days. That didn't happen here too, and you don't have to go to the Jordan River to immerse yourself. So what exactly is going on here? That's example number one. So it appears that in this Haftorah, which is talking about Naaman, who's also not Jewish, because for some reason biblical leprosy only can affect a Jew, or at least as it appears. So the what we're talking about in this Haftorah is talking about leprosy as something similar to Hansen's disease, what we know of today. And even the Haftorah after that, the Haftorah Metzora, which talks about 4 Metzoraim, 4 lepers, outside the gate of the city wall of Shomron, of Samaria. And this is the time that the battle of Aram happened against the northern kingdom. But God saved the northern kingdom and brought all these noises and the sounds of foreign armies, so that all the people who were in the camp of Aram ran away and left quickly because they were basically afraid that Israel had somehow called the Egyptians and helped in order to fight the battle with them. So these lepers who are looking to eat, because there was a famine at that time in the city of Samaria, they first wanted to go into the city, but they figured maybe we shouldn't do that. So first they went back. They went in to see what's in the camp of Aram. They said, if they kill us, they kill us. But if not, maybe we'll get some food. They walk into the camp and they see everybody ran away. It looked like they ran away and left everything behind. So they started eating from the food that was in the camp, and they started taking from the spoils in the camp. And they said, well, I think we have to, they said to each other, we have to go tell the people, we have to tell the king in Samaria that this exists, or else they'll blame us for not saying anything. So they go back to the gate of the city and they say, please tell the king we had that there's nobody in the camp of Aram, and this is not a trick. We went there ourselves, and he can just take over the camp. And the king checks it out. He sends spies to see, and he says it's correct, etc. But even in this case, these four Mitzoraim, these four lepers, they're living outside the city, what appears to be continuously. It's not like it says in this week's Parsha that for 7 days the Kohen seals them off in a quarantine or something like that, or checks to see what's going on. Again, it seems like some ongoing skin disease that they have no cure for, and they just hang out outside the city, sort of like the way Hansen's disease used to be in antiquity. So my point is that in these two haftarot are trying to show us that the biblical version of what's referred to as sarat seems to be very different of even leprosy in antiquity, which is mentioned in the haftorahs taken from the First Temple period. Already, it was not the biblical leprosy. It didn't happen on houses. It didn't happen on clothing. You didn't have to call the Kohen. You didn't have to be quarantined. And it's not even clear if they knew how to cure it. So there was something about the biblical version of leprosy, which was very unusual. And, somebody once asked the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Israel Meir HaKohen, famous rabbi of the Mishnah Brura and the book Chafetz Chaim on Lashon Hara, on how to speak. Somebody was said to him, how come, according to the Talmud and the Midrash, in biblical times, if you said bad things about somebody and gossiped about them, you would be punished with tsarat, with leprosy, biblical leprosy. And today we don't get that. We don't get that punishment of biblical leprosy. Chafetz Chaim said, yes, you do. You just don't see it anymore. So I'm going to speculate that biblical leprosy, which was very unusual, as I said, it could be on the body, it could be on the clothing, it could be on the house, was somehow affected by the human being themselves. And in order to pick it up, you had to be on a certain spiritual level to see it, because not everybody can see it. And that generation, which lived a generation of especially the ones in the Midbar, in the generation of constant miracles, there were things they were able to pick up on. However, the Torah actually says that even biblical leprosy will not start until you go into the land. It says in Parashat Tazria, when you come to the land. So if anything, maybe it was enacted during the time of Joshua, but even in the time of the judges, it's not clear that there was any type of indication of that type of a disease. Because if there was, and you used a coin, then it would have been a very spectacular type of, I would say, healing process. So was it just Josh v'kabel sachar? Was it one of those stories in the Torah where we're supposed to read about it and understand its meaning, but it might have actually not happened in reality when they came to the land? Or did it happen at the beginning, during the time of Joshua, in certain cases? But these are just not recorded, because it appears that by the First Temple period, it's not that way anymore. If you can talk about leprosy in the way it's described in the Haftarot, then it appears that by that point it is not the biblical type of leprosy at all, but a disease which we are sort of familiar with today. I want to say one last thing about these two parshiot. These two parshiot talk about tum'ah v'tahara, which means purity and impurity. Something that today it's harder for us to understand. These things mostly had to do with the issues of the temple, because when you're impure, you were not allowed to bring an offering to the temple. The priest could not enter the temple in such a way, neither could a Levite. So these were very pertinent to the temple, less to our lives. Of course, women still follow the laws of Nida, where they immerse themselves once a month at the appropriate time of the of the appropriate time when they need to be immersed during just after their periods. And this is mentioned at the end of the Parashat Metzora. And a man would immerse themselves if they had an issue, whether legitimately or not, whether by accident or by legitimate cohabitation, because as an act of purity, that was enacted also in the Second Temple period, but sort of like fell to the wayside because people were afraid to go to prayer without going to the mikveh, and therefore they would stop praying and start studying Torah until they went to the mikveh, and that the rabbis didn't think was a good idea, what we call takanat Ezra. But the point is that it starts with, as I said in the sandwich, it starts talking about purity of the body, with the case of the woman who just gave birth, and she has to be impure for a certain amount of time. It ends also with acts of purity and impurity of the body. And in the middle, you have the description of this unusual biblical leprosy. Now, Judah Levi writes in his Kuzari that all forms of tum'ah, of impurity in the Torah, have to do with the idea of the loss of life. The thing which is what's called aviavot hatum'ah, something which is the most impure, is the dead body of a human being. That's called aviavot hatum'ah, the total loss of life. The dead body of a human being is something which gives the most amount of impurity. After that, you have the other types of impurity, like tzorat, which is also, it's sort of like the body decomposing from the outside. As Moses says to God, when Miriam gets leprosy, he says, Lama tiachotenu kemet, why should our sister be like a dead child who just came out of their mother's womb, meaning the child came out dead. So Sarad was seen as a very life-threatening disease in those days because it would eat up the skin, of course, which is a protection of our whole body. And also there were 8 types of sort of reptiles, which are mentioned in the Torah, that when they die also is a certain amount of impurity. Also, when a man had a seminal issue, and when a woman would be in her period, also they would have to go to immerse themselves in water, in pure water, rainwater, which is called the mikveh in biblical and modern Hebrew. And in all these cases, there is a partial loss of life, meaning for a woman, the egg was formed, it decomposed because there was no fertilization of the egg. The man, too, when he has an issue, it was something that could have given life if there would have been an egg of a female. So all of these partial losses of life also bring let's call it an element of tum'ah, of impurity. The question would be, though, why, when a woman gives birth, which is the regeneration of life, which is bringing in new life, why would there be any tum'ah there? That's a very strange thing. Why, for a week or 2 weeks, is there tum'ah? After you have what's called demei tahara, which is its own interesting discussion, but why would there be tum'ah? And I think the way to understand it is it's true. Life is the opposite of impurity. Life and purity go hand in hand. Just like life and holiness can go hand in hand. However, the world that we live in and the way that life progresses in this world is always at a homeostasis, at a balance between forces of life and regrowth and forces of disintegration and decay and decomposition happening at the same time. What do I mean? Well, at every given time at every given point in your body, there's an ongoing war going on. Bacteria and viruses enter your body all the time. And then there are antibodies which are fighting them. So the immune system is constantly fighting various things that come into our body, whether through our food or through our nose or for our hands that we touch something and then touched our mouth, nose, or eyes. So, and especially in the winter, it happens more. And sometimes we get sick when we're slightly out of homeostasis, and then um, the immune system has to work harder in order to get over this. So that is the way life works. Life is a balance between, if you want, regeneration and decay, regeneration and decadence. We breathe in oxygen, and it oxygenates our blood through the lungs and the cycle of the blood. And then we breathe out the CO2, and we have to breathe in again if we want to live. What we call Ratzova Shov, as it says in Ezekiel chapter 1, the things go back and forth. All the cells in our body, they change, they die, and they regenerate. Over 7 years, you have new cells in your body, except for the gray matter in your brain. So everything is dying and regenerating all the time. That's the way life works. We look the same every 7 years because our DNA has the imprint of what we're actually supposed to look like. But it also has the imprint of the aging gene, which makes us look a little bit older all the time. So to come into the world is a beautiful act of life, but this world is a certain homeostasis between, as I said, regrowth and decay, always at the same time. And therefore, even when a life comes into the world, the woman has to wait for a certain amount of impurity before immersing in the rainwater and the mikvah again, because the life in the element of this world, that's the way that it works. These are things I wanted to say about Parashat Tazria-Metzora, and I wish everybody shalom, shalom, peace on Israel and the whole world.